Hey everybody, welcome back to History 430, Vietnam War, history, memory, and the American experience. Today we're going to go over the Tet Offensive, winning the battle or losing the narrative. I apologize for the noise in the background, new build and there's construction all over me, I'm sorry. But today we're going to examine one of the most important and most debated events in the Vietnam War, the Tet Offensive. Now before I jump into what happened, I want you to start with a question. Close your eyes. Imagine it's January 1968. You're sitting in the living room watching the evening news. For months, you've been hearing the government officials say America is making progress in Vietnam. Military leaders are reporting high enemy casualties. There's a growing sense that the United States might be finally turning the corner. Then suddenly, almost overnight, television broadcasts began showing fightings in cities across South Vietnam. There are images of explosions, street battles, and even enemy forces attacking the U.S. embassy. If you're watching these reports at home, what would you believe? What would you think? Would you think America's winning the war? Or would you begin to wonder if something wasn't adding up? That's the question historians continue to debate today. Was the Tet Offensive a military defeat for the North Vietnamese, but a political victory? Or did it simply expose problems that have been building for years? By the end of today's lecture, I want you to be able to examine what happened during the Tet Offensive, understand why it became such a turning point in the war, and evaluate why historians still disagree about its significance today. Before we can understand why the Tet Offensive mattered, we have to understand where the war stood at the end of 1967. From the perspective of many American military leaders, things were actually looking pretty good. General William Westmoreland believed that the United States was wearing down the enemy through strategy called attrition. The basic idea was straightforward. American forces had superior weapons, more resources, and greater firepower. If they could continue killing the enemy soldiers faster than North Vietnam could replace them, eventually the enemy would lose the ability and we would win the fighting. Military reports often pointed at body counts as evidence of this military strategy was working. So remember, attrition. At the same time, President Lyndon Johnson was trying to reassure the American people that progress was being made. Public statements from the administration suggested that victory might not be immediate, but there was growing optimism. There was people not worried about losing the war anymore. The war was going in the right direction. Now, I want you to stop and think about something. If that's the message you're hearing from the government, what expectations would you have? Go ahead and write it in your guys' discussion post. Okay? While you guys are writing, I'm going to keep going. You're probably expecting fewer attacks, more territory under South Vietnamese control, and signs the enemy was weakening. That's important because these expectations shaped how people thought how the war was going. In just a few weeks, these expectations were about to be challenged. That brings us to January 30th, 1968. Thank you guys for your comments. During the Vietnamese holiday known as the Tet, North Vietnam and North Cong forces launched the largest coordinated attack in the entire war. I'll say that again. The Tet Offensive was the North Vietnam's and Viet Cong forces when they launched the largest coordinated attacks in the entire war. Instead of attacking one single base, they struck cities, military installations, capitals, almost all at the same time. More than 100 locations were attacked. Once again, more than 100 locations were attacked. Even the United States Embassy compound in Saigon became under attack and assault. All the attackers never took control of the embassy itself. The images of fighting at one of the most recognizable American symbols in Viet Cong shook audiences all around the world. Imagine seeing those images after months of hearing victory was getting closer. And then overnight, you see these pictures. It's easy to understand why Americans began asking a simple question. If we're winning, how could this happen? So military defeat or something else? Now here's where things get interesting. If you only looked at the battlefield, you might come away with one conclusion. The Tet Offensive was actually a costly gamble for North Vietnam and the Viet Cong. The North Vietnamese and the Viet Cong. American South Vietnamese forces quickly recovered. Within weeks, they had nearly taken over every city that was taken or attacked. The Viet Cong suffered enormous casualties. Loss of life was huge, and it would be difficult to replace. From a pure military standpoint, many historians argue that the United States won that battle. So, does that mean the United States won the moment? So, not necessary. Remember the question we started with. Did the Tet Offensive change the war? Or did it change how Americans understood the war? Quick poll, really quick, in the discussion post. I want you guys to all answer, did the Tet Offensive change the war? I'm going to give you about 20 seconds. Thank you for your posts. Thank you for your posts. About 10 more seconds. All right, packing it up. Military victories don't automatically become political victories. Wars are fought on the battlefields, but they're also fought in the minds and hearts of political leaders, voters, and the public. That's exactly what made the Tet Offensive so important. So let's talk about the credibility gap. You probably heard the phrase credibility gap. That wasn't a gap between the United States and the North Viet Cong. It was the growing gap between what Americans were beginning to told about the war and what they believed or they were seeing. So what they were told and what they were seeing. And over time, that gap widened. Before the Tet Offensive, government officials often described the war as difficult but manageable. Progress reports emphasized enemy losses and suggested that the United States was steadily gaining the upper hand. Remember attrition. Then Americans turned on their televisions. Instead of seeing the enemy on the verge of collapse like they expected, they saw coordinated attacks all throughout South Vietnam. They watched Marines fighting in the streets. They saw images from outside the United States Embassy in Saigon. Whenever those images reflected the full military picture is something historians debate today. But perception matters. Walks like a duck, talks like a duck, smells like a duck, it's a duck. If millions of Americans believed the war was going differently than what was led, confidence began to erode, hence the credibility gap. That's why historians describe the Tet Offensive as a turning point. Not because it suddenly changed the military balance, but because it changed public confidence in the war. So let me ask you another question. Imagine you're President Johnson. Your military advisors are telling the enemy has suffered devastating losses. At the same time, millions of Americans are watching dramatic images. What really matters more? The military report sitting at your desk or the public opinion shaping war support back home? The truth is, both matter, right? A president can't fight a long war without military success, but he can't fight one without public opinion. Think about current events are happening right now in today's world, right? They need military success and public opinion. They need them both. That's the biggest lesson historians take away from the Tet Offensive. At this point, another important voice came into the conversation. Not a general, not a politician. His name was Walter Cronkite. He was an amazing reporter. People watched him before this. They believed in him. They relied on him. After his comments where visiting Vietnam became one of the most discussed moments in American history journalism. But there's something we want to explore next. Did Walter actually change public opinion? Or was he reflecting what many Americans already felt? So let me begin. You guys can type in the discussion post. I'll ask the question one more time. Did Walter actually change public opinion? Or was he already reflecting or posting what people already thought and were reflecting? I'll give you about 20 seconds. Thank you for your post. Thank you for your post. Still see people writing, so I'm going to give about 5 more seconds. All right, keep it going, and I'm going to keep going. At this point of the war, many Americans weren't getting their information from social media or the internet. It wasn't there yet. It was the television, the news reports, word of mouth. They were getting it from the evening news. Remember, Walter was a trusted opinion. He was a CBS news anchor that America relied on. He said it, it was true. After visiting Vietnam shortly after the Tet Offensive, Walter delivered the television editorial that became one of the most famous broadcasts in American history. Instead of predicting victory, he argued that war appeared to be heading towards a stalemate. Mind's blown. In other words, neither side seemed to be capable of victory. Now, here's where we have to be careful as historians. It's easy to hear the story and immediately conclude Walter changed America's opinion. But did he? That's actually still debated. Some historians argue that Walter's broadcast was incredibly influential because he was one of the most trusted journalists in the country. If someone had questioned any direction of the war, many Americans would have been questioning it too. But other historians argue he wasn't leading public opinion. He was reflecting already what Americans were thinking in their hearts and their minds. In other words, maybe the broadcast didn't create doubt. Doubt was already there. So let's think like historians. Remember? Let's put our historian hats on. I want you to think about the evidence for a minute. If public opinion had already been declining before Walter's broadcast, can we honestly say that one television program changed everything? Or is that too simple? Go ahead and put in the posts. Once again, the question is, if public opinion had already been declining before Walter's post, can we honestly say one television program changed everything? While you guys are writing, I'm going to keep going. Public opinion changed gradually. Political decisions are often influenced by many factors. Military campaigns unfold over months. Images, our hearts, our minds, what the milkman at the door tells us about the news, the Tet Offensive, military coverage, government statements, casualty reports, public protests, which we'll talk about in a couple weeks, and years of fighting all work together to shape how America viewed the war. Okay, so we're going to pause and reflect really quick. Before we move to the conclusion, I like to think about one final question. You guys don't have to write it down. You've already done a lot of writing. I just want you to think. If you were writing a history textbook, how would you describe the Tet Offensive? Would you call it American victory? Would you call it a North Vietnamese victory? Would you turn it a turning point, a stalemate? What would you call it? Okay, so what should we ultimately take away from the Tet Offensive? Was it the battle that changed the Vietnam War? Was it a moment that changed how Americans understood the Vietnam War? So who won? This is the question you guys are going to be answering in your next assignment, okay? Did the Tet Offensive change the Vietnam War, or did it change how Americans understood the Vietnam War? We still debate that today. Before we finish, I leave you with one question to think about. Imagine you're living in 1968. You don't know how the Vietnam War ends, right? You don't know how the American troops eventually withdraw. You don't know any of that. Would you still believe the war was moving towards victory? Thank you for joining this week's lecture. As you complete the week's readings and assignments, I encourage you to think beyond the simple question of who won the war. Instead, consider the military events, political leadership, media coverage, public opinion, how it all shaped and interacted. In history, the most important questions are rarely the easiest to answer. I'll see you next week, and we shift attention from the battlefield to the American home front. I'm excited about it. We'll explore how televisions, broadcasts, protest movements all change the public opinion. Thank you for watching. I hope this lecture reminds you about history is rarely as simple as winners and losers. More often, it's always about understanding why people experience the same event in different ways. I'll see you guys next week. Thank you for your comments, guys.